some of the poorest people in terms of what they're paid for their work, the people who are paid the worst in this country are now the people who are in the most danger. If you work at a supermarket checkout counter in most of the country, you're making $15 an hour or less. In some places, you're making $7 an hour. And yet you're exposed constantly every day to the virus. Same thing in meatpacking plants. There've been a number of meatpacking plants that have become hotspots. How much do you make working in a meatpacking plant? Maybe $20 an hour, maybe. And what we're seeing is a great resistance to the idea that you should pay people based upon anything but what it would cost to replace them. And it's almost become hardwired into our system here in the United States, much less so in other advanced economies where people are paid according to the experience they accrue over time, how good they are at the job, the skills they bring to the job and they learn at the job, and so on.
I agree with you. I look at, for instance, in the education space, I look at our kids are our future, and you and I spend probably, at least I can't talk for you, but I spend time on what's valuable to me today, but I also look at my future of what's valuable. If we were to spend more time on our kids and impacting our kids and resources with our kids in certain communities, I look at then we would be taking care of our future. So it's my life. It's you've done your niches and I've done mine. I really love what you stand for. There's another one. War is making you poor act. And that's a really interesting one because it says that you actually introduced it. I'm not sure if that's a fact in 2010. And that was the Iraq War, Afghanistan War. Was that just to regulate the dollars on where they were being spending, who was getting the contracts, that sort of thing? Or how was that monitored today?
Well, I introduced the Wars Making You Poor Act to make an important point that has gotten lost in the shuffle in the past 20 years or so. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were financed on top of the normal military appropriations. And the normal military appropriations have been running $500 billion a year now for many, many years, all the time I was in Congress and beyond. So the military gets $500 billion to be the military each year. That's a significant amount of money. Now it's virtually $1 trillion each year. All of that goes to our national defense. When the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq came along, what they did is they added to that. So, for instance, when we had 100,000 troops in Iraq, we added $100 billion on top of the existing military budget, which makes you kind of wonder, what is the existing military budget for? I mean, if you don't fight any wars and you pay that amount, and you do fight wars and you pay much more than that amount, why are you doing it that way? So what I did was I introduced a bill called the Wars Making You Poor Act, in which I said the military has to pay for the wars that we're fighting now out of its core budget, its regular normal budget, which is astronomical, as much as almost every military budget in the entire world put together other than ours. You had the Chinese budget and the Russian budget and the Iraqi budget and the Canadian budget and the German budget and the Japanese budget. You add all those together, it's just a little bit more than the core military budget. So if we're going to be fighting in Afghanistan or Iraq, that ought to be able to cover it. And to make the point, I took the money that would have been saved, the money that would have been saved by doing it that way, and I used it to cut taxes to the point where most people wouldn't pay any taxes to the federal government for income tax at all. So I rather than just saying, well, the government gets to keep the money, I said, no, we're going to redistribute it. We're going to redistribute it in one particular way, which is that more than half of the population will pay zero to the government in income tax, which would be an enormous blessing for most people because we're talking about the majority of the population. Literally, the majority of the population would have ended up paying zero in income taxes under the Wars Making You Poor Act. And I thought that that was fair and meaningful because it wasn't just talking about cut, but let's cut in a way that makes sense. And also, let's redistribute the money, explain what we're going to do with that money in a way that makes a lot of sense. Because does it really make sense that you're taxing somebody who makes $10 an hour in order to have a little bit of money left over for a war in Iraq that ought to be paid for by the defense budget itself? I think the answer is obvious. So that's what the Wars Making You Poor Act was doing, saying the military needs to pay for these wars without undergoing some kind of bake sale. And secondly, that the money that we save gets given back to people in their own pockets so they don't have to pay taxes any longer, income tax to the federal government.
Wow. Let me ask you, when you put these bills up, when you put these, these frameworks together, in your head, like with your teams there, was it challenging to push through some of the things, or did you get a lot of buy-in right off the bat? Definitely when you said you were, when you were a freshman, did you get more, buy-in the longer you were there, or did you really enroll people into, what you believed?
It depended on the bill. I mean, in those 121 cases where I actually passed a law through the House of Representatives, in each one of those cases, I needed 218 votes. There's 435 members of Congress. You need half of them plus one. So in every case that I was successful, I was able to get that kind of buy-in. But there were a whole bunch of other cases where I was unsuccessful. I actually wrote more laws, not just passed more laws, but wrote more laws than any other member of Congress. And I didn't win every time. I'll give you a good example that's in the news right now. I introduced one bill that passed that said that you could not have the military give weaponized drones, bombers basically, to the police forces. Okay, the military concocted this plan that they were going to take the first generation of weaponized drones and hand them over to domestic police officers to let them play around with it. I think we know how that would end. So twice I passed a law, twice because some of these things you have to do every year. Twice I passed a law that prohibited the military from handing over bombers to police forces. And I got enough buy-in for that to be able to pass that. But then I introduced another law that said no torpedoes, no tanks, no missiles, nothing bigger essentially than a gun. Now it could be, a military gun. I didn't exclude military guns, but I said nothing bigger than guns and ammunition can you hand over to the police forces because you're militarizing the police forces, which is exactly what we've seen the past 2 months. So I introduced a bill to cut down on what's called the Section 1031 program, which is the program under which the military militarizes the police. And I lost that one. And I said, you've got to be kidding me. You think it's okay for police officers to have torpedoes? Go ahead and explain that one to me. But amazingly to me, when I introduced that and I forced a vote on it, that bill got only 63 votes out of 435. And 2 months later, Ferguson happened in Missouri. And we saw what it was like to actually have tanks rolling, armored personnel carriers rolling on the streets of an American city in a black neighborhood. We found out what that actually looked like. And two different members of Congress came over to me and said to me, I am so sorry that I voted against your amendment 2 months ago. How did you know this was going to happen, that we'd see this? And I just sort of smiled and said, thank you very much. That's really gracious of you. I really appreciate it. But what I was thinking to myself was, how could you not know? What do you think is going to happen if you give tanks and armored personnel carriers to the police? What do you think is going to happen? So anyway, in answer to your original question, I got the buy-in when I could. We were constantly coming up with good ideas that made sense to me, that were, in my mind, progressive, that represented a better world. And we would pushed them as far as we could. And sometimes we do it one way, sometimes we do it another way. Sometimes we get to 218, sometimes we wouldn't. But, every night in my building in Washington, D.C., the last light to go out in that entire building was the light in my office. We worked that hard.
Wow. So a year and a half ago, I became a deputy sheriff out of St. Francis County, Arkansas. And it was a blessing because one of the number 2 in command there, he called me up and said, hey, we have a lot of diversity challenges. We got youth challenges. We have adult challenges. We have challenges. We could use some mentorship and coaching and support with growing the next generation. And, we talked about it for a while, and I've trained cops around the country, and it's interesting how you say militaristically, because I find that a lot of people this last couple months, they've been asking me, just seeing what's been going on, they said, what do we need to do? And I said, I believe there's 2 major things. Number 1 is policy, and number 2 is culture. The policy needs to change from the beginning of when they're recruited, when they're trained in the academy, how they're put on the street, how they're mentored, and that defines the culture with what kind of people the law enforcement agencies are hiring. Did you ever get involved in that side of it at all? Or what's your thought on like the policy side and the culture side with where we're seeing it today?
I did get involved in it because when you're a member of Congress, I hate to say this, but everybody's got their hand out. And every federal, state, and local agency wants you to get money for them. And I'm not focusing exclusively on the police at all. The water and sewer people can be quite insistent. But the police in my district, and this is a common experience among members of Congress, wanted us to get stuff for them. And that's one reason why the 1031 program has survived as long as it has. What I tried to do is to get stuff for them that would be constructive. So, for instance, one of my successes, which actually was sort of done by speaking to the right people in the right way rather than actually introducing a bill, was to make a treatment for drug overdoses readily available to police all over the country. So if they get an emergency call and they're the first responder and they go over and they see somebody suffering from an overdose, they have a pharmaceutical drug that they can administer very easily that will keep that person alive and help him or her to get to the hospital and survive. I thought that was a very constructive thing to do. I think that, you have police officers who can't possibly do that themselves. They don't have the money. They don't have the knowledge. Putting it in their hands and making it part of their common kit means that they can help to save lives, which they generally want to do. So that's an example of what I tried to do that I thought was more constructive than having armored personnel carriers break up the pavements and attack people, usually in minority neighborhoods.
Yeah. Well, I think it's amazing what you've done in your career. Absolutely loved your video when you were drilling the feds. I just saw that.
Believe it or not, I didn't mention this earlier, but believe it or not, that is the most watched video in congressional history. There are more views on that video on YouTube than any other video ever recorded in Congress, and it's been 10 years.
So I watched that video, and my thought right away was I didn't watch the whole video because I think it was on TikTok. So I saw 1 minute, and I looked, and I screenshot. I went back through the video a couple times because I had to screenshot and look at your name right in front of you. And I was so impressed with that I reached out on LinkedIn. I said, hey, I'd love to spend 30 minutes talking about what you've done. I really appreciate what you've done. I love what you're doing, today with your company, being a lawyer. I'm blessed you're part of our country and really supporting communities around the country to be the best, whether with taking